Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe here from East Dan.
Hello and greetings.
Our day has passed. Everybody is happy. As the title reveals, we're reviewing Beyond the Black River. We're going to do most of the stories that lead up to Conan the Liberator, because why not? World of Conan recommended that we do this, so we decided to follow his advice, since it hasn't failed so far.
I mean, why not?
Yeah, the first real bit of lore that's referenced in this short story is on page 1. The River Funder, which it figures that there's one called Funder in the Hyborian Age. The first character we're really introduced to is called Balthus. Balthus is a guard in the Aquilonian army, and he's pretty much almost an average Joe. There's nothing too special about Balthus, but he does show some keen wits and does play an interesting role, because this first chapter is pretty much a murder mystery. And what's fascinating is that Balthus takes up a bit of a Watson-like role without... Now, Balthus is smart, but not as smart as Watson. Balthus will end up trailing after Conan. It's mentioned that the lands near to the Scalp Creek are fertile. Scalp Creek is kind of infested with some Picts. You can imagine how this place got its name, because as we all know, the Picts, they ain't got no humanity. There is an interesting story referenced on how Balthus's uncle survived a massacre, that of Venarium, where the Cimmerians, 1,500 in total, ravaged the population, sacked the heck out of the fortified city, and just put the entire place to the torch. But the Cimmerian with whom Balthus is talking to mentions, oh yeah, I was there, I was barely 15. Which immediately has Balthus getting a little scared and going, oh shoot. I might have just because... And he also grew up with the scary stories of how bloodthirsty the Cimmerians are. A smarter version of the Picts, which, yeah, they kind of are. They're just as brutish in some ways, and they're even fiercer. The Cimmerian, however, reveals the one intro line which he always uses, I am Conan, a Cimmerian. Yeah. That's his catchphrase. It's his Bond, James Bond. Which, I don't know why later writers have such a problem with the line. It's a good one. I mean, they never took away the James Bond thing away from James Bond. We then get it revealed to us by Balthus, who mentions heard of Conan, so that we're then told Conan has such a reputation as an honorable guy that this Aquilonian immediately relaxes a little and goes, okay, so of all the Cimmerians, I'm lucky enough to run into the one with a great deal of chivalry, and who's sort of civilized in the context that he's adopted onto himself the idea of honor, which I really like that. We do have to bear in mind, though, that this is probably him around the time of his late 30s. He's been around the block, and he's done a lot of barbarian stuff and a lot of chivalrous stuff. It's mentioned that Conan is admired throughout Aquilonia, as mentioned. He's on the prowl for a series of corpses. The corpse of the merchant they find is the 5th one in a short period of time, with Conan revealing the identity of a sorcerer who's a Pict by the name of Zogar Sag. He was imprisoned nearby and escaped, whereupon he started killing a bunch of merchants. He never kills Pictish ones, so obviously he's a little racialist in that he favors his own people. He has the mark of the panther and tends to chop off the heads of his victims and to turn them into prizes on his altar. So essentially he's Jason Voorhees, except not taking the head of his mommy. The head of Tiberius has been taken, and Conan vows vengeance against Zogar in a fit of rage at having been duped and outmaneuvered by Zogar Sag. And thus ends chapter 1 of this story. What's really cool is that we see Conan cast in the role of Sherlock, where he's putting together the clues and explaining the identity of this mysterious serial killer, sorcerer, because Sag is basically a serial killer. Fantasy and murder mysteries never really seem to meet. I think the only story like that is, to an extent, the book Game of Thrones. Arguably was the best of that series, because it was a murder mystery, and it was a really, really good murder mystery. It was a whodunit, mostly with a John Aaron mystery. That being said, Howard is setting up something similar, except he's invented the idea of the fantasy murder mystery here. And The idea is we have a kind of Jack the Ripper type character, except who's a sorcerer, running around. So we'll probably have a confrontation at the end where Conan has to fight off a magician, but on the other hand, the guy's a serial killer. So that adds a different dimension to the character. We also have the fact that Sag was imprisoned and likely tortured for a time. So that hasn't really warmed him up to the Aquilonians. What we interestingly get here is, to an extent, the birth of a slasher villain as well. But Howard is weaving all these elements together. So he's writing a horror story, a murder mystery story, and an adventure story all into one.
And I'm eager to see how this goes.
Only Howard could create such a thing, could weave so many strands together and make it make so much sense.
And as I was reading it from the beginning, the thought crossed my mind that anyone who wishes to go into creative writing should read and analyze this chapter.
Yeah.
Even if it's not about the murder mystery, but at least observing the descriptions, the way it's written.
It's not the most exciting chapter, but it's a well-crafted one.
Yes, this chapter could probably improve people's writing skills.
Howard writes very basic, which is unusual with this chapter. This is a very basic chapter, because Howard usually writes in a much more advanced prose style, more akin to Tolkien's. And he makes certain stylistic decisions. He constructs chapters in a certain way, which almost only he can do. Sometimes it's very simple, but sometimes it gets so complex and so detailed. It's a very particular style, is my point. But here, he's kind of demurred from it and gone for a much more basic style. But at the same time, he's somehow interweaving three genres together. So many different concepts together. This is where he shows his mastery of prose and of short story writing, which really, really remarkable how Howard can do this. Almost every single time he writes. Almost every time he puts pen to paper. Already I'm liking it, and I'm liking the interaction between Balthus and Conan. I don't know where it's going to go, but I really like Balthus as a character, and I'm really liking the dynamic that you have Balthus, who's kind of like, what does this mean, Conan? And you have Conan. The murder mystery is not as complex as those of Sherlock Holmes. There are no murder mystery stories, there are none. Sherlock is a league apart from the other murder mystery stories. But at the same time, this is better than a lot of those that were coming out in the 1920s and 30s, and even today. And yet, Howard has also woven in horror element, which he does often do. So I don't think we have much more to add, because otherwise we're just going to keep gushing. And no one here wants to hear us simp for Howard. Although, maybe they are here for that, because we always seem to simp for him and Tolkien. And even Margaret Weis, which, I don't know, I think that it sounds a little disgusting when I say, oh, well, wait, we simped for Miyamoto Shigeru. And I'm going to hold by simping for him. I think he's got the legs for an OnlyFans account.
Definitely.
Sorry, I had to crack that joke. Hope everyone enjoyed this video and stays tuned for the next Beyond the Black River story, as we're really excited to be picking back up our book club podcasts. I think these are some of our favorite videos. And
yes, it allows us to just sit back and enjoy.
so if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button, as though you were Conan and Zenobia smashing their enemies to itty bitty pieces on their honeymoon.